So listen to this. There's no bigger trope in football than the Wonderkid who lets fame get to his head, but this guy, he took it to a whole new level. Drenthe didn't just have a god complex, he literally admitted that at the peak of his success, he believed he was God himself, which might be why he ended up peaking at 21 years of age. You see, his rise was something else. In one tournament he went from being just another promising young player to being the world's highest rated Wonderkid, being deemed the next Roberto Carlos, and then literally being signed to replace him. There was no reason why he shouldn't have had a career as successful as Marcelo, but instead, well, the moment he arrived, it went a little crazy. I'm talking about crashing into cop cars, street racing Ferraris while he was completely drunk, dating Playboy models were involved in human trafficking, sneaking girls into the training grounds in the middle of the night. If it sounded like a horrible idea, he probably did it, and well, before you knew it, he had gone from his country's greatest hope to his country's greatest shame, warming the bench at third-tier clubs and retiring at 29 to become a rapper, only to end up bankrupt and begging to come back to football, eventually even working as a nurse. And you know what frustrates me the most in all of this? This guy, he really won a genetic lottery. I mean, being a Surinamese immigrant in the Netherlands already feels like some kind of cheat code. Gullit, Rijkaard, Edgar Davids, Seedorf, Kluivert, you see, but Drenthe wasn't just another Surinamese immigrant, he was Edgar Davids' nephew. The talent really was in his genes. Wijnaldum is literally his younger cousin. Still, to keep things fair, I gotta say, in other aspects he really wasn't so lucky. At 3 years of age, Drenthe's father was shot dead in the street after getting into some problems with a local gang. It was already tough growing up without a father, but it was made worse by the fact that his mother decided to hide the circumstances of his death from Drenthe. Had he known how his father died, maybe he would have made better choices, but instead, as he said it himself, when you grow up among bad people, you have to learn to survive, and most of the time that means becoming bad yourself. And to the great distaste of his mother, Drenthe followed the footsteps of his father and joined the gang. Regardless, Drenthe was talented and I guess lucky enough that at 13, Feyennord found him and once at their academy, well, it was harder for him to get into trouble, but on the other hand, it was right at this point that everyone realized that he would probably never stop finding new ways to get into trouble, because 2 years later he joined the club's B team on a trip to Switzerland, and once at the hotel, he caught wind that some of his teammates were gathered in one of the hotel rooms playing video games, but for some reason, they didn't let him in, which somehow upset Drenthe enough that he broke into their rooms, took their stuff, and began throwing it out the window, damaging the cars below. As you might imagine, the coach immediately demanded his expulsion from the club. One of the directors, however, knowing how talented he was, managed to sort of defuse the situation, but the coach never really forgave him and pretty much never called him up to another match, leading him to be released at the end of the season and moved to Excelsior, one of Feyenoord's satellite clubs. This completely destroyed Drenthe, so much so that he decided it was all over. He wanted to quit football. The only reason he didn't was because his mother convinced him to keep going, and honestly, this could have been a teaching moment, but instead, it backfired. Once again, Drenthe was simply too talented, and before he had time to learn anything from this, they were already bringing him back, which only further planted the idea in his mind that he was invulnerable, and from there on out, things escalated. The moment he arrived at Feyenoord, he got promoted to the first team. 1 year later, one of the left backs left the club, the other got injured, and suddenly, 19-year-old Drenthe was the first choice left back at Feyenoord, which also meant that he had a guaranteed place in the Dutch under-21's quest for the Euros, and there, Drenthe made the competition look ridiculous. As I once read somewhere, it was like he was playing against kids, which is even more impressive considering that Ivanovic, Chiellini, Milner, Nani, and Witsel, among others, were all in that tournament. Drenthe was simply more skillful, stronger, and faster than anyone else. It wasn't even like he controlled the tempo of the game, he was the tempo. He was so powerful he could drag the match in wherever direction he pleased. He was a force of nature, and once the Netherlands won it all, there was no point in arguing. Drenthe was the player of the tournament. For everyone watching, he was the most exciting Wonderkid in the world, and for the people of the Netherlands, their whole team was the future, and Drenthe would be their leader. Little did they know that this golden generation would actually bring them only shame, and that Drenthe would be the worst of the bunch. Regardless, not knowing any better, at the time the comparisons came one after the other. Personally, I think the comparison to his uncle was kind of uncanny, but the most popular one was maybe the most daunting. At 19, Drenthe was being compared to the greatest left-back of all time, Roberto Carlos, and with the great man himself having left Real Madrid just months before, the club looked at no expenses. They knew the cost of replacing the irreplaceable, and so, with 16 other clubs, including Barcelona, fighting to sign him, Real Madrid put 14 million euros on the table, making him one of the most expensive teenagers of all time. For reference, it was only 1 million less than Man United had paid for Ronaldo 4 years prior, and it could have actually risen even higher had Drenthe not threatened to sue Feyennord if they didn't accept Real's bid. Regardless, on the 14th of August 2007, Drenthe was presented to the fans alongside another Dutch youngster. His name was Wesley Sneijder. 1 week later, another one who joined him. It was Arjen Robben. I think the fact that Drenthe's name holds virtually no weight when compared to those two is the greatest testament to how disappointing his career was. Still, at that moment, Drenthe was not even thinking about that. All he cared about was that suddenly he had become a millionaire. As he said it himself, I went from living with my mom in a small house to living in a chalet worth millions. It all happened in a flash. The day I arrived, Guti came to me and Sneijder. He put his arms around us and told us, "Don't worry, if you want to party, just come to me." I could barely process everything that was happening. And, well, if that was overwhelming, then Drenthe scored a 40-yard screamer on his debut and launched the hype train into overdrive, convincing everyone that he really was the second coming of Roberto Carlos. Again, as he said it himself, after that goal I set the bar too high. I just couldn't deal with it, not at that age. And that statement really checks out, considering that 2 days after his second match for the club, Drenthe crashed into a cop car at almost 5 in the morning, injuring one of the policemen. Thankfully, he tested negative for alcohol in his blood, otherwise it could have been the end. But honestly, it might as well have been the end, considering that it completely tainted his image, especially considering that that day he was accompanied by his new girlfriend, Malena Garcia, a Playboy model who was notorious for having been involved in a prostitution scandal. Oh, and I almost forgot, you gotta consider that at the time Drenthe was already married and that his wife was pregnant, so Malena was actually more like his mistress. Yeah. In fact, one of his coaches alerted everyone of what was happening, telling the Dutch press. After moving to Real Madrid, Royston became a different person. He used to be very nice to everyone, then he got back from Madrid and whenever we tried to talk to him, it was like a door was being slammed in our faces. Drenthe thought it was too important to waste his time with us. He acted like the world revolved around him. One of the first times he acknowledged me, all he wanted was to show me something he had bought. I said, "What is this?" And he replied, "It's a watch. There's only a few of them in the world. I paid 80,000 euros for it." That should have impressed me, but it just made me sad. They dumped all that money on him and he just couldn't deal with it. It wasn't just that we lost a great footballer, we lost a great guy. He needed someone to hold his hand and it just let him drift away. When recalling these events years later, Drenthe would not beat around the bush. He would admit, "At that stage of my life, I thought I was actually God himself. That's how I felt." However, the realization that he was indeed only a mere mortal would hit him like a truck. Because Drenthe was talented, sure, but a year before, Real had signed Marcelo. Honestly, back then, Drenthe was the surefire guy. Marcelo was just a talented kid who they were giving a chance. But well, considering that nowadays many consider Marcelo to be the greatest left-back of all time, you see where this is going. Basically, by the time December rolled around, 2 months had gone by and Drenthe had managed a total of 2 minutes on the pitch. It got to the point where one day, after hearing that he wouldn't be called up for the next match, Drenthe literally turned his back on the coach and left the training pitch. By January, many of Europe's B-list clubs were gathered around Drenthe like sharks following the scent of blood in the water. From Fiorentina to Aston Villa, Lyon, PSG, Villarreal and Fenerbahce, everyone wanted a taste, but Drenthe refused to live the life he had in Madrid. Eventually, a switch to left winger was enough to get him some minutes and allow him to survive the next summer's transfer market, but all that season had waiting for him was even more drama. Clearly, all of this was already becoming pretty taxing on Drenthe's mental health. You could honestly see that he was about to break, and once the Real Madrid fans began booing him, it was done. He literally got to the locker room and broke down in front of his coach, begging him to be left out of the team sheet for the next 3 games. His anxiety had gotten completely out of hand, and the way he found to cope with that stress was going out at night. In fact, he sort of became addicted to it, even saying that if there was no party outside, I would make my own party, claiming that he and Rubinho created a makeshift nightclub in his basement so that they could trick the club into thinking they were being good boys and, going to bed early. But eventually, Mourinho arrived, and 2 months later, Drenthe was being loaned out to Hercules. Most were hoping that joining one of the smallest teams in La Liga would be a sobering experience for Drenthe's ego, and in fact, over the first few months, his performances actually earned massive praise. After a bit of an injury crisis in the Dutch national team, he was even handed his international debut. But well, there's a reason why he never again played for the national team. At 6 in the morning, following a match against Malaga, Drenthe was caught driving at 110 miles per hour, going past not 1, not 2, but 6 red lights in the center of Madrid. Once stopped by the police, Drenthe refused to collaborate and instead insulted the cops, who eventually found some drunk girl lying passed out on his back seat. Drenthe insisted that she was his friend and that he was only trying to get her to the hospital as fast as possible, and somehow, he did actually get off with only a warning, but obviously the media wouldn't be as kind. Still, that was far from the biggest source of stress in Drenthe's mind, because at that point, not only did Hercules stop him from moving to Juventus in the winter, but they also sort of just stopped paying their players. So the squad got together and began planning a strike, but that's where things got kind of funny. You see, apparently when they planned that whole thing, most of the players were just conspiring for the sake of conspiring, while Drenthe literally got on a plane and left for a vacation in the Netherlands, only to eventually turn on the TV and realize that everyone else had still gone to training while the club worried over his disappearance, which prompted Mourinho to give him the scolding of a lifetime, not to mention that by the time he got back to his home in Spain, the Hercules supporters had broken his windows and painted the words "money grabber" on his walls. So yeah, it sort of all just went to hell, and even though Drenthe would then secure a much more promising loan to Everton, being nurtured by David Moyes and quickly establishing himself as a starter, even going on a streak of 1 goal and 5 assists in 7 games, he would then betray the trust of the manager over and over again. As Tim Howard would say, we had some wrong-uns at Everton, but one stood above them all. Royston Drenthe was just horrible. And if you're wondering what he did, well, first Drenthe was caught in the security cameras sneaking girls into the training center's jacuzzi at 2 in the morning. Then he began openly flirting with the idea of a move to Liverpool, despite the fact they were Everton's direct rivals. And once Everton were actually going to face Liverpool, Drenthe arrived late to the team meeting, barged in like he owned the place, and even told David Moyes to F off once he began shouting at him for interrupting the whole thing. Once he made it back to Madrid, Real didn't even try to renew his contract, they just let it expire. Honestly, it's crazy to me that not even knowing that his contract was on its last legs was enough to quiet him down for a season or 2. Regardless, years later he would admit to his mistakes, saying, "I wasn't ready to be a pro, I loved women and partying too much, and you can't combine that with football. I was always so angry, so reckless, I just kept peaking, and when the low moments came, I didn't know what to do." And the low moments did indeed come. After losing his contract, Drenthe could not find another club. Everyone knew what a headache he could be. Even Feyennord refused to take him, and after 6 months without a team, he ended up at Alanya Vladikavkaz, a recently promoted club in Russia. However, things there didn't last either, and his most notorious moment that year was recording himself drinking beer with one hand while he drove his Ferrari with the other. Somehow he still managed to return to England, joining Reading, where he was so poor that he ended up training with the under-21s before being sent on a 6-month loan to Sheffield Wednesday and then being let go on a free transfer to Sport. Once there and completely disillusioned with football, Drenthe tried to cash in with a move to Bania Sport Club in the United Arab Emirates, but the club would struggle to afford the massive contract they had offered them, and after going 4 months without pay, Drenthe just let it all go to hell and quit football at 29 years of age, simply telling the press, "I am no longer a footballer," and then trying to jumpstart a career as a rapper before trying to make a switch to acting, failing at both, and not only getting his ego crushed, but finally getting taught some serious life lessons, which which eventually made him realize how much he had wasted his life, leading him to come back to football, signing for Sparta Rotterdam in the Dutch second tier, playing incredibly well for someone who was out for so long, getting them promoted and then deciding to leave the club as he wasn't sure he could deal with the stress of top-flight football, and instead gladly going down one more tier and joining Kozakin boys in the 3rd division. A move I'm sure he seriously regretted, considering that 1 year later he would declare bankruptcy after racking up losses of around £3.2 million without any explanation, confessing on Dutch TV that he was especially concerned with his financial situation, considering that by then he had 7 children from 4 different women. Quickly moving to Racing Murcia in the Spanish 4th division, trying to round up some cash, only to still somehow end up getting kicked from the club for being out of shape, supposedly weighing at 96 kilos, and eventually ending up at Racing Merida in the 6th tier with a crew of reporters traveling to watch one of his matches, only for him to be benched for the whole 90 minutes, leading them to write, "The man who played for Real Madrid doesn't play for Racing Murcia, not today. There is no classic tale of redemption, and it's more realistic this way." However, I have to disagree. There was some redemption, it just didn't come from football. Today, Drenthe works taking care of dementia patients, and as he said, "My mom was a nurse and this job is helping me find myself while I help others. It helped me realize that I don't always have to be cool, that it's okay to take a step back and show your sweet side sometimes." His story is a great reminder that it's never too late to grow up.